in the world does the health department have to do with planning? Well, I'm going to tell you. Health in a community for an individual is much more than the absence of disease or the access to care. It's healthy housing, it's safe communities, it's connectivity, it's walkability. All of those things contribute much more to our health than just access to care. So we at Knox County Health Department are very involved, really want to be more involved in creating that environment where folks can make a health choice very easily. Data shows that residents that live in a town, in a place where it's walkable, have a decreased risk of diabetes, obesity, and all the things that go along with that, heart disease and doctor visits and everything else. So having a walkable, connected community has positive effects on our population, our community's economic growth, and the vitality of our neighborhoods. And thanks to a grant from the Tennessee Department of Health, focusing on making physical activity an integral and routine part of life. That routine part's the hard part here in Knox County sometimes, so we're shooting for that. We're able to bring exceptional speakers like Chuck to advance the dialogue and discussions around these important issues that don't just impact the health of our community, but impact economic development and the prosperity of our community. So, Chuck is here to speak to you this morning, but also there's a statewide conference of planners and engineers going on where he'll be speaking later today, so that's another reason he's here. So this is not just happening in Knox County, it's happening across the state, so we're excited about that. So hopefully we'll start to make an impact on our poor health outcomes, diabetes and hypertension and obesity leading the way. So. And now it's my honor to introduce.
I really am grateful for that opportunity. I worked many years as a civil engineer doing regular municipal projects, building streets, sidewalks, sewer, water extensions, even at an airport, runway extension at one point. Went back to graduate school and got a planning degree and worked with cities all over the state of Minnesota, not only writing building permits, but also doing development reviews and environmental assessments and all the things that planners do, comprehensive planning and ordinance revisions. I kept coming back to this one fundamental question. Why are cities struggling financially? Why, despite all the growth, all the projects, all the incentives, all the things we do to generate wealth, why do we struggle so much? Why can we get money to build an extra 2 lanes on a shortcut around town, but we can't keep the library open past 4:30, and we can't keep the streetlights on overnight, and we can't paint a crosswalk? So the work that we did early on started to look at our development pattern, the way we actually go about building and assembling our places, and what some of the financial ramifications of that are. This is my hometown. I'm from a little town, Brainerd, Minnesota. It's 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Right as the Canadian forest kind of comes down into the U.S., it extends, up to and a little bit past my hometown. So we're kind of on the edge of the forest. This is what it looked like in 1870. And the fascinating thing about this photo is that this photo is really interchangeable with every city that has ever been built prior to our kind of post-World War II way of building. Every city, including this one, started out as a little collection of pop-up shacks in the middle of nowhere. And over time, what we see in this style of development is that we would have an incremental pattern of growth. Our cities would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. So this is how it started in 1870. By 1904, this same exact street would look like this. Those little pop-up shacks now would be out on the edge of town, as that was growing out incrementally, but the core would have grown up and become more intense. And after another 40 years of this style of development, this incremental style that we see universally around the world prior to that kind of Depression, World War II inflection point, after another 40 years of growing incrementally up, incrementally out and becoming incrementally more intense, the same street in the mid-1940s would look like this. Those 2- and 3-story wood structures would be replaced with buildings of brick and granite. There's a huge difference between the underlying fundamentals of this style of development and the style of development we do today. And I'm going to talk about this a lot more at the noon presentation, if you can make it to that. But in the summation, there's two main differences. A lot of people focus on the automobile. It is not the automobile. It really is more to do with the financing of the way we build. Today, when we build all at once to a finished state, as opposed to incrementally on a continuum of improvement. And I'll say that again. We build all at once, so in large blocks, to a finished state. When we build something today, we're building it and we walk away, we're done. It is built. Prior to our modern approach to development, and really that inflection point is the Great Depression, World War II. Prior to that, all development was built on a continuum of improvement incrementally. These photos I've shown you kind of document, what that continuum looks like. Cities would start here, and they would proceed on a continuum through to Manhattan, right? And you were somewhere along that line, but you were always kind of either holding on or trying to move to the next step. There was this continuum throughout all parts of the cities, all neighborhoods, where we were renewing and growing naturally. What we have kind of as our core insight is that when we grow in this way, this incremental, slowly over a broad area, over a long period of time, what we see is it builds an amazing amount of wealth in a very resilient kind of way. These are two identical pieces of property in my hometown. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted, the one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. If you look at these, you'll see they're the exact same area, they've got the exact same amount of public infrastructure, they're on the same street, the same thoroughfare, the same neighborhood. Everything about these properties is the same, except for the style of development.
And more parking.
Yeah. Well, that's a factor here. Here's what that old and blighted block looks like. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks. And so what you see here is that pop-up shack equivalent of the 1920s. This would be the far edge of town. This was the cheapest kind of thing you were going to build out there. The idea would be, as the city would continue to grow and expand, over time you'd get a 2nd story, a 3rd story. They become more intense, more valuable buildings. That's not what happened, though, right? These were built in the 1920s. You had then the Depression, you had World War II, and then we have a completely different style of development that just skipped right over this and started building further out on the edge. These buildings have stagnated for 90 years. The city labeled these 3 blocks blight. They had the one 2 blocks over torn down, and now we have the new drive-through taco joint. Everybody was thrilled with this, right? We got rid of blight. The planner was happy because the new development meets all the city codes, it meets all the setbacks, all the parking requirements, the sign ordinance. The engineer was happy because we got rid of that on-street parking. Now the traffic flows through more quickly. The environmental people in town were happy because they actually got a little bit of green space now, and they got them to put some natural plants in the stormwater area. The bike walk people were happy because they got a sidewalk put in there. The sidewalk ends right there. There's a little bit of hope now for the future. Here's what nobody bothered to consider. That old blighted rundown block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, when it was built, had a value of only $800,000. From a property tax standpoint, the city collects 42% more taxes from that old and blighted rundown block than from a brand new. And from a sales tax standpoint, it is roughly the same ratio. understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, this kind of slow, messy, human scale, incremental way of building that we built cities for thousands of years around the world with. You're looking at that in its infancy, after 90 years of neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. And everybody in this room knows the trajectory of the taco joint, right? 20 years from now, that'll be a used car lot, there'll be a new taco joint up the road somewhere. 10 years later, it will be boarded up, they'll be selling something illegal out the back, and we'll be trying to get some kind of grant to get it torn down, right? In fact, in the 2 years subsequent to this being built, here's what happened to the property values. This is the same kind of thing we see out on the edge of our cities. This is our big box Mills Fleet Farm complex. So you've got a double-sized big box there, an auto dealership, a gas station. This is 19 acres, the most valuable piece of property in the entire area. When these people show up at a council meeting, we just stop the meeting and say, you know, what do you guys need, right? This is 19 acres of our core downtown. Our core downtown, we would kill to have a little bit of the love that you guys have going on here. Most of our second and third stories are not occupied. Our first stories really struggle. In my life, there's been no new buildings built. Quite a few that have been torn down or burnt down that are now parking lots. Yet when we look at these 19 acres, out on the edge of town, we see a total value of $0.6 million an acre, a lot of wealth generated in one piece of property. But when we go to the downtown and that incremental, messy, traditional development pattern, we see a wealth that is 78% greater. Now, we spent hundreds of millions getting that development out on the edge of town. We ran the bypass. We spent tens of millions getting sewer and water out there, frontage roads, backage roads, enormous investments in infrastructure. In the downtown, nothing, right? This is wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their contemporaries built slowly and incrementally over time. When we look out at the edge and we see the Mills Fleet Farm building, even though it is a very valuable piece of property today, we know that Mills Fleet Farm won't be here forever, right? We don't have the Hudson Bay Company, right? Every company has a life cycle. At some point, this will not be the highest and best use of that property, but what comes next? What comes next? Who knows? But we've seen these sites before, right? We know that this is the peak today. Whatever does come next will be lower on the economic scale than what is there now. But we look to that downtown, there's 134 different properties down there. What happens when one of them loses a tenant? When one of those businesses is no longer viable? What happens when someone retires, or we figure out that we have too much residential property and not enough office space, or not enough too much office space and not enough retail? These buildings are highly adaptable. They're very flexible. They can change and evolve over time. Not only is this style of development incredibly productive financially, but it's very resilient and adaptable. These are some micro images. I'm going to show you in the macro now, because these are trends we see everywhere across the country. A good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy out of Asheville, North Carolina, his team have modeled hundreds of cities around the country. We see the same thing every single time. What I'm going to show you right now is the financial productivity. If you think of a farm field, the farmer goes out and spreads seeds. The places that grow the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. What I'm going to show you is the financial productivity, the value per acre of different types of development. So this is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York, I like to start with because after World War II, Buffalo was completely hollowed out. They have lost population every year, every census since 1940, in a steady decline. If you go there today, there's a ton of parking ramps, a lot of empty space, a lot of boarded up buildings. Yet when we say, where is the residual value, where's the wealth in a city like Buffalo, can you point to where that traditional downtown is? And not only is it financially really, really productive despite all the decline, but it outperforms everything around it by a huge margin. We see this in cities of all sizes. Big cities, mid-sized cities, such as this one in upstate New York, we see the same type of pattern. And we see it in very small cities as well. This is a little town of 1,200 near where I live. When I first went to this city, they said, Chuck, we've got some really great stuff going on out here. We've got some really great stuff going on out here, but these neighborhoods here are terrible. We got to find a way to get this stuff torn down and replaced by something better. And then we showed them where all their wealth was. It's in those poor neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods with the really poor people. We did...
Wealth as in potential wealth, is that what you mean?
No, that is actual wealth.
That's actual.
That's actual, the assessed value of those properties. Those are the taxes. We did a study in Lafayette, Louisiana. Joe's team and us had strong towns, where we went beyond just the wealth, the revenue, and said, what are the costs that the city's experiencing? We mashed them together. And actually, Joey Durrell, the mayor at the time, came to us and said, I'm term limited out. Said, I'm going to be done here. I'm getting a lot of pressure on the way out to raise taxes because we have these huge gaps in maintenance funding. We can't fix our roads. We can't fix our sewer pipes. I'm getting this pressure to raise taxes. But I'm stepping back and I'm realizing that if I raise taxes, the little bit that they're saying, that's not really going to solve the problem. Help me understand and solve this problem. And so we went in, and what we did is we looked at every single property in the city, and we said, how much does this property generate in revenue? So from taxes, from fees, from utility bills, every source of revenue, how much are we getting from each parcel? And then what does each parcel cost to serve and maintain? How much does it cost to get the road and street there and keep it fixed? How much does it cost to get the pipes there, to drain it? How much does it cost to provide police protection and fire protection and on all these services? And we wound up with two separate maps, one of costs and one of revenue, and then we merged them together. And this is what we came up with. And I apologize to anyone who in this room who's red-green colorblind. Red and green. In my naiveness, I did not realize that was a thing. And I have a couple people pointed out to me, so I've red and green. Let me walk you through this. So there's a huge green spike right there. That green spike is a new urbanist neighborhood, relatively new. So by new urbanist, I mean it is a neighborhood built in the traditional development style, but with modern financing. So it was built in like tight streets, tight blocks, but with all at once to a finished state. Right now it is the most financially productive part of the city. It's an open question as whether it will stay that way, because every house was built within a 5 to 10 year period of time of each other. Everybody's roof is going to fail at the same time. Everybody's sidewalk is going to go bad at the same time. Everybody's appliances will fail at the same time. So without a renewal mechanism in this neighborhood, is there going to be enough wealth there to sustain it generation after generation after generation? It's an open question. But right now it's doing fantastic. To the west of that, to the left of that, or I'm sorry, to the right of that spike, to the east of that, is an area of their downtown. This area right in here. Now, Lafayette would kill to have your downtown. Lafayette's a nice city, it's a college town, but the downtown is largely a collection of dive bars and okay restaurants and not a lot of successful retail. It's a place that has really struggled. They're working hard to bring it back, they're working hard to make some good investments, but it's really, really struggled. Still, financially, that's in the green. It is very, very successful. There's a crescent here, out in this part. This crescent that runs through here of green, those are the poorest neighborhoods in town. Those are the parts of town where, when we were looking at getting a place to stay, they said, you don't want to go there. That's where the burglaries and the murders and all that stuff happen. That's the poor part of town.
Did this grow west to east?
Yeah.
So, what's out here? This is all red. That stuff there is all red. Up there is all red.
And by the way, the higher the higher the line goes, the more in the green or the red you are. What's all that red stuff out there? That's the mall, the big box stores, the strip malls. Those are the housing developments on the cul-de-sac with the 3-car garages. That's all the shiny and new stuff. What you're looking at here are 2 subsidies. They're 2 universal subsidies that we see everywhere around this country. Subsidy number 1, the poor neighborhoods subsidize the affluent neighborhoods. This is a universal condition of American development patterns. Subsidy number 2, future generations are subsidizing today's generation. Today, we have built all of this stuff. And we, to whatever extent we call it enjoyment, we enjoy the benefits of all this stuff that we built. Future generations will not be able to maintain everything we have built. And in Lafayette, the typical household today pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order to make good on every promise represented in this map, those taxes would have to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. That will never happen. That will never happen. And so what that means is the future generations of Lafayette residents will have to decide, we're not going to fix that road. We're not going to fix that pipe. We're not going to maintain this public facility because we don't have the money and we cannot possibly get it. As an example, right now they have a $45 million backlog in road maintenance. Their annual road maintenance budget is a little over $2 million. They add about $4 million of backlog every year. So not only are they not catching up, they're falling further and further behind. They could double their road budget, which is impossible in many ways, and they still will not catch up. When we look at what this development looks like, it gives us a sense of what is possible, of what we can do and how we can start to think differently about this. These are in High Point, North Carolina, but really they could be anywhere because the numbers are very similar. You've got the Kmart at $384,000 an acre. You've got the Walmart at $967,000. The city was very proud of these. They actually had done a big project to put in an interchange and run sewer and water up to them and provide some subsidies so they could get this growth. But then we look downtown at the stuff that is a little less flashy. And you see a supper club that's a former abandoned warehouse, $5 million an acre. And then my favorite one, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. 10 times the financial productivity of the Target, 4 times that of the Walmart. When we start to have a conversation in our communities about growth and development, we're very conditioned for a number of reasons to look at the top line. What's the big flashy thing? What's the big number? How do we get the big site that has the big dollar amount attached to it? But anybody who has run a business or anybody who has done any serious financial analysis understands that the top line number doesn't matter. It's the bottom line number. It's the productivity. It's what you're getting back for what you put in. It is very easy for us as cities to grow. We have this down from the federal government and Wall Street down to the local level. We have created a very efficient system to allow our cities to grow and grow and grow. But in the process, what we've done is forced our local governments to take on these enormous long-term liabilities. And now we are drowning in them. When we step back and we look at something like Jimmy's Pizza, what we realize is that in a different era where the finances of our place had to matter, where you built something it was going to be your money that took care of it, or it wasn't going to get taken care of. What we see is that cities started out very small, very fine grained, and they made good use of everything that they built. And as they grew and developed, it was not a quick, for them often it felt quick, but it wasn't this, overnight success the way that we perceive growth today. It was a slow incremental process over a broad area, over a long period of time. And the fascinating thing about this is from a public policy standpoint, when we talk about public health and obesity and diabetes and all these other things that have come about really in the last 60 years to the fore, we realize that there's a very strong link to the cities that evolved with us over centuries, and now a development pattern that we are being asked to adapt to very different situations. So when we look at a place like Jimmy's Pizza, we have to ask ourselves, do we have what it takes? Do we have the wherewithal, the sophistication to build something as complex and exquisite as Jimmy's Pizza? Because if we do, that's not a very high bar. We can start to create enormous amounts of wealth in our communities at very low cost and provide a tremendous amount of opportunity for people who want to bootstrap themselves, who want to get a business started, who want to create the American dream again. Our greatest, highest returning investments today are not going to come from the top down. They're not big, they're not flashy. They're very, very small, they're very attention to detail, and they're very much focused around improving the small little quality of life things that make a city worth living in. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to, for the time that you guys will stick around, chat about any of these things. Thank you.
Talk about your hometown, since you had a hand in managing the planning and stuff for some years.
I had no plan. They would never listen to me. I worked in cities all around my hometown, but you're never a prophet in your own land. And they don't listen to me. In fact, a lot of this stuff
growing outward as opposed to concentrating inward.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is a story of American cities. I mean, my city, land-wise, we are the same population we were in 1940. We are 20 times the land area. So what has happened, and we see this in every city, big and small, across North America. You had cities that were quite compact, and they were compact really because of market forces. I mean, when you developed incrementally in this way, what you saw was that the stuff out on the edge was very marginal. The people who invested there were, upstarts, bootstrappers, hoping that as the city would grow, their fortunes would grow along with it. But you didn't have utilities, you didn't have paved streets, it was marginal stuff. And as things grew, all of that prosperity would kind of start to grow with it, incrementally. But when you hit the Great Depression, cities were very, very compact. After World War II, what we said is that, from the top down, we can create widespread prosperity for everybody by taking these, spreading that out over a broad area and kind of, hollowing out our city. So what happened is the core actually lost population, lost people, and we spread them out across the countryside. This worked. If your objective was growth, we created a ton of growth in a very short period of time. We, got out of our World War II debt. We did not slide back into the Great Depression. We created all kinds of growth and jobs. And even today, we look back nostalgically, right, at the 50s and 60s as being this time of American greatness. Yet what we did is we achieved this by essentially sloughing off these burdens out of the future. And you can see kind of this correlation of when we reach the point of the first life cycle of this, where liabilities started to pile up, and we had to go back and fix things and take care of stuff. From a national level, we kind of started to hemorrhage. Think mid-70s, early 80s. And it took us a while to kind of adapt, but how did we adapt? We adapted by taking on lots of debt. And the second generation of this experiment, and really the third generation, have been hallmarked by massive increases in private sector debt, and now massive increases in public sector debt. And, you know, we're running at...
So you generationally shift the problem.
Yeah, we have cemented in our brains that this is how you create prosperity. And we created this system to deliver it over and over and over. And that system is kind of on autopilot, kind of running away from us. And you know, we have people working in public health saying, hey, it would be a lot better if kids could walk to school. You know, we wouldn't have this obesity problem, because, I mean, when people were younger, they used to be able to bike and walk places, and now they can't. You know, you have people who deal with elderly, who say, you know, locking people up in a campus 3 miles out of town, and then, you know, bringing a shuttle bus so they can go to the casino once a month, is not exactly the quality of life we aspire to. Maybe it would be better if people could live integrated into a neighborhood. But you can't today without a vehicle in most places. So what we're starting to see is that, you know, delivering growth is something we figured out really well. But all the other components of life and prosperity have kind of taken a back seat. To me, there's two types of very useful debt. Type number one, we are investing money. We're borrowing money, we're investing in it, and we are expecting an actual cash return that retires that debt. And not understand that governments are not you know, gambling institutions. So where banks and, you know, individuals will take on debt, you know, they'll risk things, and we need people who will do that. We're stewards of the public purse. So those kind of investments make me really leery. I'm more of a Warren Buffett kind of guy when it comes to that. I want to make, if I'm going to borrow money to invest as a municipality, as a steward of the public purse, I'm going to be like Warren Buffett, where I'm going to have an almost guaranteed payback to do that. To me, that's one example of debt that is good. The other one is a little more nefarious. It is the cash flow debt. What is a cash flow debt? So we have all these roads in the city, and we got to go out and fix them and upgrade them, as you said. Well, they don't all come due in nice, even spaces. Sometimes a bunch of them need to be worked on, and then we might have some years where they don't, or not as many. So what we do is we borrow money from a cash flow standpoint to kind of make it through those surges.
I mean, spread it out.
Let's say that you went out and you built your development, and you have 5 miles of road, and you built it all at one time. 25 years later, all those roads will need maintenance at the same time. If you're the city, you would not tax 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 100% of the cost. What you do is you tax a little bit each year, and ostensibly, you know, you don't have like a sinking fund, but what you do is that money goes to fix this one, and then this one comes over to fix this one, and you cash flow it. When you have a big surge like that, you borrow the money. The problem is we're not rigorous enough in our accounting to know when we have a cash flow problem versus an insolvency problem. And a lot of times what cities do is they have an insolvency problem. We're short of cash, we have all these roads to fix. And so as opposed to doing what Lafayette did, which is to go out and say, why do we have this problem? Where are we bleeding money? Where do we have excess? What they do is they just borrow the money. Because we can convert the cash we have to payments, and it makes it go a lot further. What we see in places that do that, and on a statewide level, New Jersey, for example, has been doing this a long time. New Jersey, 100% of their gas tax now goes to paying debt. In Texas, it's like 70% goes to paying debt. So you start down this road and it's very logical at first, and then you reach places where it becomes absurd. So I wouldn't draw the distinction between debt for the outside versus the inside. I would draw the distinction between debt where you have a specific project with a high degree of confidence that you're going to get a rate of return, and then cash flow debt where you actually have done a rigorous financial analysis and know here's the gap we're trying to fill, and here's how that's going to be paid for. Does that make sense?
It does. It's interesting because as I listen to the way you explain it, it makes perfect sense. We are now having to, when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about pipes and
Yeah.
wires under the street.
Yeah.
But we have hit that next generation where it's all failing at the same time.
Right,
And
right.
So we have to do something, or we have interruptions in service.
Right.
And so how do you get out of the spiral is the question. And
Yeah.
and we've got very, very tight financial analytics. I'm confident we can pay it because of the increased value and taxes that will come with all the good stuff happening downtown. But it does, in some ways, reinforce your point
Right.
that, and it's hard to do sewer lines incrementally.
In many ways, yes. Well, and you know, governments are hamstrung. And I think a lot of times we get frustrated, you know, why don't governments look further ahead? Why aren't they more proactive? You know, who are all these incompetent fools who run these places? Well, the reality is, we're here. I'm saying this rhetorically, obviously. You know, governments, we run year-to-year budgets, cash budgets. We don't, you know, and the most thoughtful among us will have, you know, long-term, like, capital budget projections. But you still come back to a cash accounting system, not even an accrual accounting system. This is where there's a movement of geeks around this country that are pushing to have cities use accrual accounting as opposed to cash accounting, or have at least like 2 sets of books. And the difference is when we put those pipes in the ground, right now today on our accounting sheets, that's counted as an asset. And it's an asset that depreciates. So if a developer comes in and builds a whole new development and we take it over, all of a sudden our balance sheet looks really, really rich. And then over time, it will degrade a little bit because the pipe gets old and the street gets old, and then it will go to zero, depreciate. Okay, think of it if you did it this way, because this way is more inherent in the promises we've made. When the developer does the development, it you know, comes in, and the asset we have is the new tax base and the cash flow stream from that. But over time, we have a liability that starts at zero and grows to the cost of fixing the road. Because 25 years from now, we got to go out and fix that road. And that's a big bill. And so what we do is we start accruing that as if it were like a pension liability, right? So we're actually accounting for it. When you do that, what you see is that cities that say, we're really good financially, we track our stuff really closely, we're really smart, we have a cash flow positive, all of a sudden become massively hemorrhaging negative.
What you need to do
Just
is
from a
fund
different-
depreciation.
Who does
I
that?
said you should.
No, but
That's
yeah.
the way to get around that.
It is, but I'll give you the counter argument to funding depreciation. If you were like a condo association, you would fund like a sinking fund to fix the roof of the building, right? But if you're government, what you're doing is taking money out of the private sector and just having it sit in a government account. You're kind of putting it to a pretty low use. And so what we've generally said across this country is that you can't do that. You can't create, you can create capital funds, but you can't do sinking funds. And I'm not really opposed to that personally. I don't know that's a bad, I don't know as you want local government sitting on collectively trillions of dollars of money, kind of, you know, dead money for future projects. But if we were all accountants, that's how we do it.
Or you just use that money to incrementally continue to improve your infrastructure. You didn't just sit there waiting for the next wave of destruction.
Yes, the problem is, and I get you, you're right. The problem is we're not all like prudent accountants. You're gonna get the politician who will come in and say, hey, we got $20 million sitting here. It's earmarked for roads and streets. Here we go.
It's called Social Security.
Please, yeah, we've been there, right?
So you've done a really good job explaining how we got here in development and how, and distinguishing the differences of value downtown. We've got multi-use and then single use out in the suburbs. I mean, what's your suggestions? What's for the future? I mean, tell me where we've been, but how do you see us moving forward in trying to, take that Walmart and Kmart at $100 million an acre and turn it into $3 million an acre?
Some of those, well, okay, since you asked it in that way, with that kicker on the end, because my answer, my kind of simplified answer is, we need to actually go from a development pattern focused on top-down big chunks to actually very fine-grained stuff. So the Jimmy's Pizza is a model that we kind of intellectually reject because it seems beneath us. The idea that our highest return investments are things like planting trees and putting in crosswalks and making it easier to get across the street, those are actually the things that have really high payback today. But they're beneath us, and our systems of government don't deliver them because we're so attuned and kind of set up to deliver the big project. So we have to start changing those systems of government and capital investment and really our cultural expectations so that we can deliver fine grain over a broad area as opposed to big. But you mentioned, how do we get the Walmart at $1 million an acre to be $3 million and $5 million and $10 million? I think that is a good thought to start with, but only if it is hedged with the realization that most of what we have built will never go that direction. When we look at Lafayette, for example, if you said, okay, $1,500 a year, the typical resident pays, we need $9,200 a year to maintain all this stuff, maybe we could get $2,000 a year, maybe we could get $2,500 a year if we're crazy. What does that get us? Well, that gets you maintaining something slightly bigger than that green area, which means over half of the city land area over the next generation is going to be effectively abandoned. That seems insane, right? That seems crazy. Because if you think of, we are in a battle, we take a hill, we'll die on that hill as opposed to retreat to the last defensible position, right? We've reached this point where here's our city, how could we do this? Yet there's an example of this, right? I don't know how many of you have been to Detroit. Everybody has a...
What's left of it?
Yeah, well, everybody has an explanation for Detroit. If you're on the left side of the political spectrum, you have an explanation. If you're on the right side of the political spectrum, you have an explanation for Detroit. To me, in the context of this conversation, Detroit is very easy to understand. Detroit got started with this new experimental way to build before everybody else. They did it more vigorously than everybody else. And they arrived at the logical destination ahead of everybody else. So I think it's a good question to say, how do we get this $1 million an acre property to a $3 million? I think that's the right set of questions. You're right on. As long as you have a decent understanding that a lot of those places will go to zero. And what I think we have to do in a humble way is say, I don't know which ones are going to go to 3,000 and which ones are going to go to zero. So we're going to do small investments over a broad area, over a long, we're going to do small investments over a broad area. And the places that see success will double down on that success with more small investments. So we're in a period of like nurturing gardening as opposed to, planting.
Could you talk about the crescent and what Lafayette should be looking at in that crescent you said was older and poorer, that yet is sustaining
Well,
some of the big pieces?
You look at those neighborhoods that are run down, there is no reason why the sidewalks in that neighborhood shouldn't always be fixed. The streetlights in that neighborhood shouldn't always be fixed. The pavement shouldn't always be fixed. When you invest,
Because it's successful?
it's generating surplus wealth. Okay, think of you're running a business. You have 4 divisions. One division is really profitable, and the other 3 are losing you money. If you were a city, what you would do is you would go start a 5th division, just like those other 3. What we should do is look at that one division that's profitable, say, how do we keep this
Build on that
profitable
model.
and make it better?
Build on that.
And then use the excess, success we get to look at our other 3 divisions and say, which of these can we turn around? That is a very antiseptic way to look at it, because there are people living in these places, and there's, passion for these places, and this is a difficult, I'm making what is a difficult cultural conversation into a math problem, and it's not that, it's a difficult cultural conversation, but if we were treating it like a math problem, that is what we would do. Please.
So let me ask a clarifying question before I get to what may be
Yeah,
a
yeah.
convoluted point. When you refer to wealth, is that just another way of talking about revenue to the government?
No.
Because that's what I'm hearing you say that some of the poorer communities have some of the most wealth. And so I'm trying to figure out wealth to who?
It is actual, that's a great question. We really have to talk about this in terms of individual, family, business, property owner, and those are commas between those, wealth. How much wealth are we building throughout our community? And the example that I've used in the past, if you look at the Empire State Building in New York City, it's valued at like $2.6 billion. The owner of that building, I don't know who they are, some corporation somewhere, they're not going to be ruined by the $10 million to fix the street in front of it, right? Because there's so much wealth there that little investment is not a big deal. When you go to, and I've seen this exact example, a $30,000 trailer house on a 2-acre lot on a cul-de-sac on the edge of town, where we run $40,000 worth of sewer, water, and road to, there's no way the wealth of that will ever pay to sustain this. So by putting that public infrastructure in, all we're doing is condemning the owner of that to public servitude in a sense, to pay their debt back. When we look at those poor neighborhoods in Lafayette, what we see is that unlike the stuff out on the edge, which is very wide, very big, you might have a house every 300, 400 feet, you have a house every 20 feet in those lots. So even though the house may only be worth $60,000, $80,000, the amount of wealth that is required from that property to maintain the stuff that they need to be there is very small.
So it's
As a percentage,
self-sustaining?
it's a very small part.
It's self-sustaining.
Yeah.
So
What I'm really trying to get you to think about is the ratio of private investment to public investment. And if you go out to the edge of the city, we had development like this in the past. We would have on the edge of our cities, in the days before this experimental way to build, we would have the person who wanted to live out on the edge in the big lot. But what would they have? They would not have a paved street. They would not have sewer and water. They would not have fire protection. They would not have police protection. We'd get there in time, but I grew up on a farm 3 miles out of town. When it snowed in the winter, if our house went on fire, the police, the fire truck's not going to get there. We would get plowed out after 2 days sometimes. We were the last people. Why? Because we were way out in the middle of nowhere. Today, we have a standard in that same exact city that everybody will be plowed out by 7 a.m.
Right.
That is an unreasonable level of service.
So.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say,
Have I
so-
answered? Did I explain that?
Yeah, I think so. I think kind of what I was going to try to get at still, to a certain degree, stands. And I will use Knoxville as a bit of an example. So I'm a fan of our downtown center city. I live within a 3 and 4 mile radius, live, work, play, that sort of thing. And so I appreciate the density of the footprint of kind of our original city. But there's a ton of economic activity that happens in this area, a lot of local business and that sort of thing. But a lot of the economic activity that happens here is generated with dollars that are earned west of downtown Knoxville in a more suburban, sprawling sort of area. And so when I see and hear kind of what you're saying, I agree with you philosophically,
Yeah.
and I don't know that you're making a philosophical point, but I'm interpreting it philosophically.
Huh?
But when I see that Walmart at $1 million an acre, I see maybe the wealth or the value of that property. But what I feel like in business, it's the almighty dollar, but in government, it's the almighty job. And so that's the carrot that gets dangled in front of government leaders, is jobs, jobs, jobs. And so, you know, those folks that are working at Walmart in those shopping centers are earning money that they can then come downtown Knoxville and spend. And I don't see.
That's a great theory. And I mean, we've built a whole entire national economy based on that theory. I've looked and dug into enough places where we've actually started to call that the quantum theory of economic development. You know, quantum theory in physics, you can't really measure anything directly, and when you do, it changes everything else in the equation. That's kind of how this works. It's like, well, we got people spending money here and there, and you know, it circulates around, and it's all good. And the reality is when we step back and look at it in the macro, it's not all good. And when we look at individual places, it's not good. Here's what we did in Lafayette, and I think this is a good way, because Lafayette, I want to say 40% of their budget or 50% of their budget is sales tax. And so, you know, they've been very much about jobs, because the idea of a job is that someone will move to town and they'll spend more money and they'll be making more money, so they'll spend more money, and this is how we'll pay for all this. So what we did is we said, okay, what percentage of people's spending is essentially non-discretionary? In other words, you run into a recession, and places that are dependent on sales tax have this happen to their budget. During good times, they got tons of money. During bad times, they go really bad. But there's a baseline you don't go below. Why? Because everybody pretty much still has to buy toilet paper and toothpaste and, you know, a certain amount of clothing and what have you. In Minnesota, we've made a crazy sales tax system because we exempt all those necessities. So we have like the true.
You have no baseline.
We have no baseline. So during a recession, our sales tax just drops to the floor. And then during good times, like right now, we have huge budget surpluses. What we did in Lafayette is we actually ascribed that revenue that was the baseline to the property where the person lived. Because, and let's just take the idea of toothpaste. If we're gonna buy toothpaste, and I wanna say it was like 70% of the budget was you know, like non-discretionary, and 30% was the float. I think that's the number that we came up with. We did some research into that. If you have that bought at a Walmart or at a corner store, you're still gonna make that purchase. That is not like geographically dependent. What was geographically dependent was when we agglomerated, like all the iPods will be at Best Buy out here, and all the cars will be out here. You can't buy a car from a corner store. Those things became like site specific, and then we allocated those to a site. But for the most part, what you're talking about in a system, this is why sales tax-based systems are so insidious. Because in a sales tax-based system, the ideal resident either lives outside the city and just shops in, So we don't have to provide them any services, they just
Bring
give us
free money into
Yeah.
the system.
Or they move to town wealthy, spend themselves into huge debt, and then leave, right? Well, either way, the interest of the collective city, all of us as taxpayers, is at odds with what is good for the individual. What's good for the individual is to build their own individual, family, or small business wealth and equity over time. And our tax systems in general are set up to capture a certain amount of that wealth. And so the wealthier our community becomes, the easier it is to make do on all these things. So when we talk about wealth, what we're really talking about is how prosperous is everybody in the community. And in these very poor neighborhoods, what you see is that while the actual number is not really high, the other side of the equation, the expense, the burn rate, is also very, very low. So these neighborhoods tend to be really, really productive financially. We're done? We got one more?
I enjoyed your presentation. One thing, when I talk to developers, they say, we've had a lot of development downtown. They say it's a lot easier to do, a strip center or
It is.
an apartment complex.
Yeah.
When we do a downtown development, if it's multi-stories, multi-use, a lot of times we've had to subsidize these with pilots and tips. And I think that's been going around the country. And so I think people outside the center city are saying, hey, the city's doing all those subsidies of downtown. What about,
Yeah.
areas outside of downtown?
Yes. Everything you said is true.
How do we reverse that?
Well, I think it's important to understand a couple different components about that. First, if you want to build a single-family home, or an apartment building, or a strip mall, there is a secondary market set up for all those things. So the local bank can finance that easily because they can check a couple boxes on a form and then hold that loan for 30 days and send it off to a security place where it's securitized and sold to pension funds around the world. There's a ton of liquidity there. If I want to do something complex and messy, like I want to buy a 3-story place and have my house on the 3rd floor and rent out the 2nd and then have a retail place on the 1st, that's got to be a local bank. And they're going to require 30%, 40% down, all kinds of equity, because they're taking on a lot of risk because they can't turn around and give that loan to somebody else. So
Because it's too complex, you're saying.
because it can't be standardized. Yeah. I mean, this is the whole lesson of the 2008 crisis, right? In housing. The assumption behind all of our financial models was that the housing in Florida is uncorrelated to the housing in California and Arizona. And what we found out is that no, you finance them all the same, you've built them all the same, you have the same zoning codes, the same building codes, they're all the same house, and so they all failed at the same time. So I think recognizing that there is a difference in the way they're financed kind of opens us up to looking at how would we become more friendly to alternative funding sources. Not only local banks, but there are now some really exciting community investment kind of funds we can put together, private sector stuff, where people can, without going through the whole SEC complex things of creating a fund the way that you've had to in the past, can actually almost like crowdsource in $1,000 increments that equity part of an investment locally. There's a lot of financing things going on in that route. From strictly a city government standpoint, I think we need to intellectually do one really important thing, and that is we need to make the next increment of development as easy and by right as possible. And I realize that maybe is a lot of planning jargon, if you think of the next increment, if you think of a community growing incrementally, the next increment for a single-family home is not a 6-story condo unit. It's actually a duplex or a building with an accessory apartment. Right now, it's actually, in most places, the same level of complexity to build the 6-story condo unit as it is to build a duplex. We have the same process, the same review, the same neighbor notifications, the same timetables. So if you're a developer, it is almost like you work at scale, because you can get financing at scale and you can get through approval processes at scale.
So you're saying facilitate a smaller increment?
What we need to do is make it so that the guy who sees the house going to foreclosure and wants to buy it and convert it into a duplex should be able to walk in at 9 a.m. and walk out at noon with a permit. Because that's the next level of intensity. And if we just across the board say the next level of intensity is an easy, over-the-counter, no-brainer, what we will start to do is free up a whole spectrum of developers that largely don't exist in our cities today. There's this group called the Incremental Development Alliance. What they are doing is going around the country training, and it's not all young people, but largely it is young people who are flocking to this, training people how to be small developers. And by small developers, I mean the person who sees the empty lot between the two homes and then goes and builds a home there. That's something that large-scale developers don't do because they can't do it at scale, but the small developer can.